This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crises is a book written by two economists, Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, which focuses on the history of financial crises over the past 800 years and extracts some commonalities and laws that are very helpful in understanding the operation of modern financial markets and the possible risks in the future. First, let's take a look at the structure of the book. It is divided into three parts. The first part is an overview of the history of financial crises in the past 800 years, the second part is an in-depth analysis of the financial crises in each period, and the third part is a forecast and recommendations for possible future financial crises. In the first part, the authors mention the commonalities and laws of financial crises. They find that financial crises are often triggered by borrowing bubbles, and these bubbles are usually caused by excessive credit expansion by governments and financial institutions. At the same time, the authors describe the impact of financial crises on the economy and the ways in which governments and central banks respond to financial crises. In the second part, the authors further analyze the financial crises in various periods, including the South China Sea bubble, the Asian financial crisis, and the US subprime crisis, among others. Through their analysis of these crises, they reveal the causes, effects, and responses to the crises, and give some specific recommendations for these crises. In the third part, the authors make predictions and suggestions on the possible future financial crises. They point out that future financial crises are likely to involve emerging market countries because their financial systems are relatively fragile and may be triggered by external pressures. At the same time, they also put forward some policy recommendations, including strengthening supervision, reducing excessive credit expansion, etc. The first chapter of This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crises is an introduction that provides an overview of the book and gives the reader a basic understanding of what is to come. In this chapter, the authors first introduce the main subject of the book, the financial crisis. They explain what a financial crisis is and why it should be studied. They point out that financial crises have a huge impact on the economy and society, and that they are often the result of a combination of many factors that require in-depth study and analysis. Next, the authors present the research methodology and data sources of the book. They explain how to collect and organize data on financial crises over the past 800 years, and how to use these data for analysis and forecasting. They also introduce some common economic terms and indicators, such as GDP, money supply, inflation rate, etc., which are very important when studying financial crises. Finally, the authors briefly introduce the structure and content of the book. They explain the main content of each section and emphasize the importance and usefulness of the book. They encourage readers to read the book to understand the history and laws of financial crises and the ways in which governments and central banks deal with them, so that they can better cope with possible future financial crises. In summary, the first chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis is a brief overview that gives the reader a basic understanding of the book's main content and purpose. It provides an introduction to the definition of financial crises, research methods, and data sources, and a general overview of the book's structure and content, setting the stage for the in-depth research and analysis that follows. The first chapter of This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crises is an introduction that provides an overview of the book and gives the reader a basic understanding of what is to follow. In this chapter, the authors first introduce the main subject of the book, the financial crisis. They explain what a financial crisis is and why it should be studied. They point out that financial crises have a huge impact on the economy and society, and that they are often the result of a combination of many factors that require in-depth study and analysis. Next, the authors present the research methodology and data sources of the book. They explain how to collect and organize data on financial crises over the past 800 years, and how to use these data for analysis and forecasting. They also introduce some common economic terms and indicators, such as GDP, money supply, inflation rate, etc., which are very important when studying financial crises. Finally, the authors briefly introduce the structure and content of the book. They explain the main content of each section and emphasize the importance and usefulness of the book. They encourage readers to read the book to understand the history and laws of financial crises and the ways in which governments and central banks deal with them, so that they can better cope with possible future financial crises. In summary, the first chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is a brief overview that gives the reader a basic understanding of the book's main content and purpose. It provides an introduction to the definition of financial crises, research methods, and data sources, and a general overview of the book's structure and content, setting the stage for the in-depth research and analysis that follows. The third chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is entitled The Impact of the Financial Crisis. In this chapter, the authors explore the economic and social impacts of the financial crisis to help readers better understand the severity and effects of the financial crisis. First, the authors discuss the economic impact of the financial crisis. They point out that the financial crisis will lead to economic recession, rising unemployment, business failures, currency devaluation, and other problems. In addition, the financial crisis will also have an impact on international trade and investment, leading to a decline in the global economic climate. Next, the authors explore the impact of the financial crisis on society. They point out that the financial crisis will cause social instability, widen the gap between the rich and the poor, and threaten the democratic system. In addition, the financial crisis will have an impact on people's lifestyles, such as reduced travel and increased family stress. Finally, the authors discuss the long-term effects of the financial crisis. They point out that the financial crisis will have an impact on the long-term economic and social development, such as affecting people's trust in financial markets and changing the policy and regulatory environment. In conclusion, the third chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is a chapter that explores the economic and social impact of the financial crisis. By analyzing the economic and social impact of the financial crisis, the authors help readers better understand the severity and impact of the financial crisis. In addition, the authors explore the long-term effects of the financial crisis and remind readers of the need to pay attention to the potential impact of the financial crisis on the future. The fourth chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is entitled Government and Central Bank Approaches to the Financial Crisis. In this chapter, the authors explore the ways in which governments and central banks have responded to the financial crisis, thereby helping readers to better understand the strategies and measures to deal with the crisis. First, the authors discuss the role of monetary policy in the financial crisis. They point out that central banks can mitigate the effects of the financial crisis by adjusting interest rates, providing liquidity, and purchasing assets. In addition, they discuss the limits and risks of monetary policy, such as inflation and currency devaluation. Next, the authors explore the role of fiscal policy in the financial crisis. They point out that the government can stimulate the economy by increasing spending and cutting taxes to mitigate the effects of the financial crisis. In addition, they discuss the limitations and risks of fiscal policy, such as fiscal deficits and debt problems. Finally, the authors discuss the role of financial regulation in the financial crisis. They point out that financial regulation can help prevent the occurrence of financial crises and can help restore the stability of financial markets after the occurrence of a financial crisis. In addition, they discuss the limitations and risks of financial regulation, such as overregulation that may inhibit economic development. All in all, Chapter 4 of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of financial crises, is a chapter that explores the ways in which governments and central banks respond to financial crises. By examining monetary policy, fiscal policy, and financial regulation, it helps readers better understand the strategies and measures used to deal with the financial crisis. In addition, the authors discuss the limitations and risks of these policies and remind readers of the need to be aware of the risks associated with their implementation. The fifth chapter of This Time is Different, a history of 800 years of financial crisis, is the Tulip Mania, 1637. In this chapter, the authors explore the prosperity and collapse of the Dutch tulip market in the 17th century, thus helping readers better understand the nature and dangers of financial bubbles. Tulip mania refers to an event in the Dutch tulip market in the 17th century, when the general interest and enthusiasm for tulips in Dutch society reached such a high level that the price of tulips skyrocketed. Tulips were originally introduced to the Netherlands from Turkey and were favored by the Dutch for their unique color and shape. As the Dutch passion and interest in tulips grew, they became a luxury item and their prices rose gradually. In the middle of the 17th century, the tulip market in Holland reached its peak, and the price of tulips rose sharply, becoming a frenzy. Investors invested large sums of money in tulips, hoping to get high returns from this investment. However, the bubble eventually burst in 1637, with tulip prices falling rapidly and investors suffering huge losses. The tulip mania had a serious impact on the Dutch economy. Many investors went bankrupt because of the losses, which led to the recession of the Dutch economy. In addition, the tulip mania also affected the economies of other countries, as the Netherlands was one of the largest economies in Europe at the time and its economic activities had a significant impact on other European countries. In conclusion, the fifth chapter of This Time is Different, A History of the 800 Years of Financial Crisis is a chapter on the tulip mania, 1637. The analysis of the formation and collapse of the tulip mania will help readers better understand the nature and dangers of financial bubbles. The collapse of the tulip mania had an impact on the Dutch economy and the economies of other countries, reminding the reader of the need to be aware of the potential impact of financial bubbles on the economy. The sixth chapter of This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crisis is the French stock bubble, 1720. In this chapter, the authors explore the formation and collapse of the French stock bubble in the 18th century, thus helping readers better understand the nature and dangers of financial bubbles. The French stock bubble refers to a 1720 plan by French finance minister Montesquieu to reduce the interest burden on French national debt. The scheme aroused the enthusiasm of investors who bought shares of the French East India Company and the Mississippi Company in the hope of getting high returns from this investment. The French government also actively promoted the plan and, through publicity and public sentiment, further pushed up stock prices. The rise in stock prices caused more investors to join, which further pushed up the stock prices. In just a few months, French stock prices rose several times or even dozens of times, creating a huge bubble. However, the bubble eventually burst in 1720 and stock prices fell rapidly, causing huge losses to investors. The collapse of the French stock bubble had a huge impact on the French economy. Many investors went bankrupt as a result of the losses, which led to the recession of the French economy. In addition, the French stock bubble also had an impact on the economies of other countries, as France was one of the largest economies in Europe at the time and its economic activities had a significant impact on other European countries. In conclusion, the sixth chapter of This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crisis is a chapter that examines the French stock bubble, 1720. By analyzing the formation and collapse of the French stock bubble, it helps readers better understand the nature and dangers of financial bubbles. The impact of the collapse of the French stock bubble on the French economy and on the economies of other countries reminds the reader of the need to be aware of the potential impact of financial bubbles on the economy. The seventh chapter of This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crisis is the British South Sea Bubble, 1720. In this chapter, the authors explore the formation and collapse of the South Sea Company stock bubble in 18th century Britain, thus helping readers to better understand the nature and dangers of financial bubbles. The South Sea Bubble was an economic bubble that occurred in England between the spring and fall of 1720, and was one of the three major economic bubbles of early Europe, along with the Mississippi Bubble and the Tulip Frenzy. The term economic bubble originated from the South Sea Bubble. It originated with the South Sea Company, which was founded in 1711 while the War of the Spanish Succession was still going on. The company was a private organization that helped finance the government by sharing the government's war-related debts. The South Sea Company was favored by outsiders for its exaggerated business prospects and fraudulent practices. In 1720, the South Sea Company even bribed the government by proposing to Congress a plan to exchange South Sea stock for national bonds, which made the South Sea Company's stock highly sought after. At the beginning of the year, the stock price rose from £120 to more than £1,000 in July of the same year, and the entire population was crazy about the stock. However, many bubble companies emerged in the market, trying to take advantage of the rising stock prices in the South China Sea. In order to regulate the emergence of these illegal companies, Congress passed the Bubble Act in June, and the stock market frenzy subsided, which also triggered a sharp drop in the share price of South Sea's companies. By September, it had plummeted back below £190, leaving many people with no money to lose. After all, even the famous physicist Sir Isaac Newton left with a bewildered look on his face. The South Sea bubble destroyed public trust in the government, and many conservative officials stepped down or were accused of the incident. Instead, the Whig politician Robert Walpole managed to clean up the mess, helped compensate shareholders, and restored economic normalcy, thus taking control of the government in 1721, and was later hailed as the first Prime Minister of England. After that, the Whig Party replaced the Tory Party and dominated the British politics for many years. As for the South Sea Company, it did not go bankrupt because of the bubble, but in fact it suspended its trade with South America after 1750 and did not finally maintain business until 1853. The South Sea bubble, along with the French Mississippi Company in 1720 and the Dutch tulip fever in 1637, were the three major economic bubbles that erupted in early Western history. Among them, the South Sea stock price in the South Sea bubble was like a rising and falling bubble, and the term bubble economy was developed to describe the phenomenon of economic overheating and contraction. The South Sea bubble brought a great shock to the United Kingdom and left a shadow on the nation towards the joint stock companies, and the bubble law enacted in the event was not repealed until 1825, reflecting that it took a long time for people to slowly regain their appreciation of joint stock companies. Confidence. The famous physicist Sir Isaac Newton was also one of the victims of the South Sea bubble. He made a small profit of £7,000 when he first entered the South Sea stock, but the second time he bought the stock price peaked, and he left the market with a loss of £20,000. Newton once lamented, "I can calculate the movement of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of man." The original bullish stock soared more than 10 times, did not expect the final stock price collapse. Newton lost more than £20,000. That's the equivalent of 600 years of salary for a skilled worker. You can buy 185 horses or 240 dairy cows. From the real events of history, there are profits and losses in investment management, and each investment strategy has its own risks, which anyone who invests should understand and face each loss carefully. The collapse of the South Sea bubble had a serious impact on the Dutch economy. Many investors went bankrupt because of the losses, which led to the recession of the Dutch economy. In addition, the South Sea bubble also had an impact on the economies of other countries, as the South Sea Company was one of the largest trading companies in Europe at the time, and its operations involved trade and investment around the world. In conclusion, the 7th chapter of This Time is Different, A History of the 800-Year Financial Crisis is a chapter that examines the South Sea Bubble, 1637. By analyzing the formation and collapse of the South Sea Bubble, it helps readers to better understand the formation and collapse of the financial bubble. In This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crisis, the 8th chapter discusses the U.S. financial panic, and 1837 was also a major economic crisis in U.S. history, the U.S. financial panic of 1837. The year 1837 was also a major economic crisis in U.S. history, the American financial panic of 1837. This event is described in more detail below. The U.S. financial panic of 1837 was the first large-scale economic crisis in U.S. history and one of the most serious financial crises in U.S. history. The crisis was caused by the rapid growth of the U.S. economy in a short period of time, which led to the formation of a bubble economy. Prior to this, the U.S. economy had experienced a period of rapid growth, particularly in investments in land and transportation infrastructure, which attracted large amounts of foreign capital to the U.S. market. However, this bubble eventually burst in 1837, leading to bank failures, business bankruptcies, and mass unemployment. The trigger for this crisis was the sudden tightening of monetary policy by the Bank of England, which led to a sharp increase in domestic interest rates, thus making it impossible to renew U.S. foreign debt. Banks began to fail on a large scale, and the collapse of banks further triggered business bankruptcies and expanded unemployment. The entire economy was thrown into chaos and panic. The impact of the American financial panic of 1837 was enormous. The crisis led to massive business bankruptcies and unemployment, and people were unable to make ends meet because they lost their jobs. In addition, bank failures and the collapse of the financial system led to a financial crisis for the government. The effects of the crisis lasted for several years, and it was not until 1844 that the U.S. economy gradually recovered. In short, the 8th chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, discusses the American Sheep Bubble, 1837, which was also an important economic crisis in the history of the U.S. economy, the American Financial Panic of 1837. This crisis was caused by the formation of a bubble economy, which led to bank failures, business bankruptcies, and mass unemployment. The crisis had a long-lasting negative impact on the U.S. economy and served as a reminder of the formation of bubble economies and the potential dangers of financial crises. The 9th chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is the American Railroad Bubble, 1857. In this chapter, the authors explore the boom and bust of American railroad construction in the mid-19th century, thus helping readers better understand the nature and dangers of financial bubbles. The U.S. railroad bubble refers to an event in U.S. railroad construction between the 1850s and 1860s. At the time, the U.S. government encouraged railroad construction and people were eager to invest in railroad companies in hopes of getting high returns. This led to the formation of the railroad bubble, and many investors poured large amounts of money into railroad companies. However, this bubble eventually burst in 1857 and the U.S. economy fell into a financial crisis. Many railroad companies went bankrupt because they could not repay their debts, and investors suffered huge losses. The collapse of the railroad bubble had a serious impact on the U.S. economy. Many banks and businesses went bankrupt, unemployment rates rose sharply, and the U.S. economy was plunged into a prolonged depression. The collapse of the U.S. railroad bubble also served as a reminder of the dangers of financial bubbles. It showed that enthusiasm and investment in a particular industry or sector can lead to the formation of a bubble, which in turn can have a serious impact on the entire economy. All in all, the 9th chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is a chapter on the U.S. railroad bubble, 1857. By analyzing the formation and collapse of the U.S. railroad bubble, it helps readers better understand the nature and dangers of financial bubbles. The collapse of the U.S. railroad bubble had an impact on the U.S. economy, which reminds readers of the need to be aware of the potential impact of financial bubbles on the economy. The 10th chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is the American Cotton Bubble, 1873. In this chapter, the author explores in detail the causes, effects, and lessons of this crisis. The 1873 U.S. cotton bubble refers to a financial crisis caused by the rapid expansion of the U.S. cotton industry in the late 1870s, a boom in market speculation, and a large number of bank loans for cotton speculation. In this crisis, a large number of banks and enterprises went bankrupt, unemployment rate rose sharply, and the whole U.S. economy entered a 6-year-long depression. One of the main causes of this crisis was the speculative boom in the cotton market. At the time, U.S. cotton production increased dramatically and cotton prices rose, attracting a large number of speculators and investors to the market. Banks also joined the boom, providing huge loans to speculators and promoting the cotton market bubble. However, the cotton bubble eventually burst in 1873, causing a large number of speculators and banks to go bankrupt. In addition, the U.S. economy faced a number of other problems in 1873. For example, the US government issued large amounts of money after the Civil War, which led to inflation and devaluation, and increased bank loans, creating a certain financial bubble. In addition, the US government also issued a large number of bonds after the Civil War. The high interest rates of these bonds attracted a large number of investors, but also laid the groundwork for later economic problems. The economic impact of the 1873 US cotton bubble was very serious. The crisis led to a large number of bank and corporate bankruptcies, a sharp rise in unemployment, and a 6-year depression in the entire US economy. In addition, the crisis exacerbated the US government's fiscal woes and led to a series of political and social problems. All in all, the 10th chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is an essay on the US cotton bubble, 1873. The crisis was caused by a combination of speculative boom in the cotton market and massive bank lending to speculation, which had a long-lasting effect on the US economy. The crisis was a reminder of the need to be vigilant about the formation of financial bubbles and the support of speculation by financial institutions, as well as the impact of government monetary and debt policies on the economy. The 11th chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is the US stock bubble, 1929. In this chapter, the authors discuss in detail the causes, effects, and lessons of this crisis. The 1929 US stock bubble refers to a period of extraordinary prosperity in the US stock market in the late 1920s. The boom index was rising, stock prices were soaring, and many people thought that investing in stocks was an easy way to get rich. However, this stock boom eventually broke down in 1929, leading to a global economic crisis. This crisis was also known as Black Friday. One of the main causes of the crisis was the excessive prosperity of the stock market and the speculative boom. In the 1920s, many people saw stocks as a great investment option, so investors and speculators poured into the market, driving up stock prices. Many people also bought stocks by borrowing large sums of money, which further exacerbated the market bubble. However, on October 24, 1929, the stock market suddenly plunged and investors sold their stocks, plunging the market into chaos. This event led to a global economic crisis, with many banks and corporations going bankrupt and unemployment rates rising sharply. In addition to the excessive prosperity of the stock market and the speculative boom, there were other factors that contributed to the outbreak of this crisis. For example, the 1920s was a period of rapid economic development in the US, but there were also some underlying problems, such as shrinking agriculture, trade protectionism, and a widening gap between the rich and the poor. In addition, the US government made a series of bad decisions on monetary policy in the 1920s, which aggravated the instability of the economy. The US stock bubble of 1929 had a huge impact on the world economy. The crisis led to a global economic depression, with many banks and corporations going bankrupt, unemployment rates rising sharply, and a long-term impact on the global economy. The crisis also prompted a re-examination of the nature of financial markets and resulted in a series of reforms to avoid similar economic crises in the future. All in all, the 11th chapter of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis, is an essay that examines the US stock bubble, 1929. The crisis was caused by a combination of excessive stock market prosperity and a speculative boom that had a huge impact on the global economy. The crisis served as a reminder of the need to be vigilant about the dangers of financial market bubbles and speculative behavior, to strengthen market regulation, and to develop more prudent economic policies. The 12th chapter of This Time is Different, a history of 800 years of financial crisis, is the Japanese bubble economy, 1980s. In this chapter, the authors discuss in detail the causes, effects, and lessons of the crisis. The Japanese economy in the 1980s was a unique phenomenon known as the bubble economy. During this period, Japanese stocks, real estate, and land prices all experienced sustained increases, and the economy boomed more than any other country. However, this boom eventually burst in the early 1990s, leading to a prolonged period of economic stagnation in Japan. One of the main causes of this crisis was the Japanese government's excessive intervention and overly loose monetary policy. In the 1980s, the Japanese government adopted a series of policies to stimulate economic growth, including lowering interest rates and expanding credit. These policies led to a wave of speculation, and many people began borrowing heavily to buy real estate and stocks, which further pushed up prices. In addition, the Japanese government stimulated economic growth by building large amounts of infrastructure and promoting technological innovation, but these measures ultimately led to overinvestment and waste of resources. In addition to excessive government intervention and monetary policy, there were other factors that contributed to the outbreak of the crisis. For example, there were structural problems in the Japanese economic system, such as the mutual support of corporate groups and banks, which led to the instability of the capital market. In addition, Japan's aging population and low fertility rate also had a long-term impact on the economy. The Japanese bubble economy in the 1980s had a huge impact on the Japanese economy and the global economy. The crisis led to a prolonged stagnation of the Japanese economy and had a huge impact on the real estate market, the banking industry and corporations. In addition, the crisis also had an impact on the global economy, especially on the outbreak of the Asian financial crisis, which had a catalytic effect. In conclusion, the 12th chapter of This Time is Different, A History of the 800-Year Financial Crisis is an essay on the Japanese bubble economy, 1980s. The crisis was caused by a combination of excessive government intervention and an overly loose monetary policy, which had a huge impact on the Japanese economy and the global economy. The crisis is a reminder of the need to be vigilant about the dangers of excessive government intervention and market bubbles, to strengthen regulation of the market and to formulate more prudent economic policies. Chapter 13 of This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crisis is the Asian Financial Crisis, 1997. In this chapter, the authors discuss in detail the causes, effects, and lessons of the crisis. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 was a crisis caused by a combination of factors that involved the monetary, financial, and economic spheres of Southeast Asian countries. The crisis started in Thailand, where the devaluation of the currency, Thai baht, triggered a financial crisis in the entire Southeast Asian region. One of the causes of the crisis was a series of policies adopted by Southeast Asian countries in the 1980s and 1990s to promote economic growth, including foreign investment and borrowing, which led to high economic growth in these countries. However, there were problems with the way these countries grew, such as borrowing too much foreign debt and spending large amounts of money on infrastructure and the real estate market, which led to structural problems in these countries' economies. In addition, another cause of this crisis was the instability of international financial markets. In the early 1990s, global capital markets began to flood into Southeast Asian countries, which led to excessive bubbles in their currency and stock markets. However, when the economies of these countries experienced problems, this capital began to flow out, leading to currency devaluation and economic collapse in these countries. This crisis had a huge impact on the Southeast Asian countries and the global economy. During the crisis, many Southeast Asian countries experienced currency depreciation, economic collapse, and soaring unemployment rates, which led to global economic instability. In addition, the crisis has revealed a number of flaws in the international financial system, including the poor response of the International Monetary Fund and the policy failures of some countries. All in all, Chapter 13 of This Time is Different, An 800-Year History of the Financial Crisis is an essay on the Asian financial turmoil, 1997. The crisis was caused by a combination of factors, including structural problems in the economies of Southeast Asian countries and the instability of international financial markets. The crisis had a huge impact on Southeast Asian countries and the global economy, reminding people of the need to be alert to the flaws of the international financial system, to strengthen the regulation of markets and to formulate more prudent economic policies. Chapter 14 of This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crises is the U.S. Subprime Crisis, 2007. The crisis was triggered by the default of the U.S. subprime mortgage, which spread to the global financial markets and had a huge impact on the global economy. The roots of the crisis can be traced back to the late 1990s, when the U.S. economy was booming, housing prices were rising, and banks and other financial institutions began to make more loans, including high-risk subprime mortgages, which offered higher interest rates and required lower repayment ability from borrowers. However, these higher-risk subprime loans soon began to default, causing banks and other financial institutions to suffer significant losses. In addition, many financial institutions resold these subprime mortgages to other financial institutions, creating what became known as the subprime crisis. This crisis erupted in 2007 when many subprime mortgages defaulted, resulting in huge losses for many financial institutions, including the big banks and investment banks on Wall Street. The bankruptcies and failures of these financial institutions triggered turmoil and instability in the global financial markets. The crisis had a huge impact on the global economy and affected the economies of many countries, especially those that rely on exports and international trade. In addition, the crisis has revealed problems with many financial institutions and regulators, including excessive deregulation and lack of transparency. In response to the crisis, countries around the world took a series of measures, including government bailouts and reforms of financial regulators. These measures were not as effective as they could have been, but ultimately helped the global economy survive the crisis. All in all, Chapter 14 of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis is an essay on the U.S. subprime crisis. The crisis was triggered by the default of U.S. subprime mortgages, which spread to the global financial markets and had a huge impact on the global economy. The crisis revealed many problems with financial institutions and regulators, and served as a reminder of the need for stronger financial regulation and more prudent economic policies. Chapter 15 of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of financial crises is a discussion of possible future financial crises. While it is impossible to predict the type and timing of future financial crises, the book presents a number of possibilities that are based on current economic and financial trends. The following are some of the possible financial crises. 1. Debt crisis. Many countries and companies are currently facing huge debts, which may become unsustainable if interest rates rise or the economy declines, leading to a debt crisis. 2. Real estate crisis. The fluctuation of housing prices and a large amount of real estate speculation may lead to a real estate crisis, especially in cities where housing prices are already high. 3. Fintech crisis. With the development of fintech, many new fintech companies have entered the market, but these companies may face the problem of lack of regulation and inadequate risk control, which may lead to a fintech crisis. 4. Exchange rate crisis. If a country's currency depreciates too quickly, it could lead to an exchange rate crisis and trigger reactions from other countries, leading to global economic instability. 5. Large-scale cyber attacks. With the rapid development of information technology, the frequency and scale of cyber attacks are increasing. If a large-scale cyber attack destroys the core infrastructure of the financial system, it may lead to a financial crisis. These are just a few of the possible financial crises. In fact, there are many other factors that could lead to a financial crisis. However, the occurrence and impact of financial crises can be reduced by strengthening financial regulation and developing more prudent economic policies. In addition, financial institutions and investors can also reduce financial risk through diversification and effective risk management. Chapter 16 of This Time is Different, an 800-year history of the financial crisis is a discussion of policy recommendations, focusing on the prevention of and response to the financial crisis. The following are some of the policy recommendations. 1. Strengthen financial regulation. Financial regulators should strengthen regulation, including enhancing risk assessment and supervision of financial institutions, setting more stringent capital requirements and risk management norms, and enhancing regulation and monitoring of financial markets. 2. Enhance transparency. Financial institutions should enhance transparency, including the disclosure of financial reports and risk profiles, and strengthen information disclosure and anti-money laundering measures, so that regulators and investors can better understand and assess the risk profiles of financial institutions. 3. Establish emergency plans. The government should establish emergency plans, including the handling of bankruptcies and collapses of financial institutions, as well as measures to deal with financial market turbulence and crises, to ensure a quick and effective response in the event of a crisis. 4. Strengthen international cooperation. International regulators and financial institutions should strengthen cooperation among themselves, including sharing information and experience, and enhancing cross-country cooperation and coordination to respond to global financial crises. 5. Enhance financial education. Governments and financial institutions should enhance financial education, including raising public awareness and understanding of finance and investment, and providing investors with more comprehensive and accurate information to help them make more informed investment decisions. In summary, the policy recommendations are intended to reduce the incidence and impact of financial crises and to protect investors and the stability of financial markets. These recommendations require cooperation among governments, regulators, financial institutions, and investors to promote the healthy development of financial markets. Overall, this book is a very worthwhile read. It not only provides an in-depth study of the history of the financial crisis, but also offers some specific policy recommendations that will be of great help in understanding the operation of the financial markets and the risks that may arise in the future. If you are interested in financial markets, or want to understand the history and future trends of financial crises, then This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crises is definitely a book worth recommending. Another important feature of this book is its practicality. Readers can learn how to deal with the financial crisis, including how governments and central banks adjusted their monetary policies, how to reduce excessive credit expansion, and so on. In addition, the authors also explain the differences between the economies of different countries and regions, which is also very helpful for readers to understand the operation of international financial markets. Finally, I would like to emphasize again that this book is very valuable in understanding the financial markets and predicting future trends. If you are interested in financial markets, or want to understand the history and future trends of financial crises, then I highly recommend reading This Time is Different, A History of 800 Years of Financial Crises.